Hey, what's up, y'all? This is DJ Wiz from Kid and Play, and I'm listening to the ESP. Don't y'all know it's a house party up in here? You better tune in.
Good evening and welcome to ESP Speaks and Jax. It's just me this evening as Jax is still dealing with a family situation, but she does send her very best. Tonight, we're going to be dealing with an extremely sensitive subject and volatile. It's become very volatile in our communities of late. With the numbers of COVID going through the roof, and it affecting the Black, Brown, and Native American communities, I thought it pertinent for us to sit and really get into the details of the information regarding this vaccine. So I have brought in a top medical professional with regard to the subject. We will be speaking to Dr. Kevin HOLCOMB. Dr. HOLCOMB is a prominent obstetrics and gynecological physician and is the vice chair of gynecology and associate dean of admissions for the WEIL CORNELL Medical Center. We will also have a word from our resident theologian, Reverend Dr. Leo Colon from In His Presence Family Worship Center, as the pastors in our community are also very important with regard to the information and how it is dispersed. Because we as a people tend to lean on our churches for information. So doesn't it make sense that we should combine the two? So please join me in welcoming first, Dr. Kevin HOLCOMB. So, Dr. HOLCOMB, thank you so much for being with us this afternoon. It's really an honor.
Well, thank you so much for the platform. It's such a pleasure to be able to reach a number of people in one setting. And so I've been looking forward to opportunities to do this. And so when you reached out, I was more than happy to participate.
That's wonderful. That's what, and as my brother from growing up, we were children together. This all means so much to me to be able to have your word and your stamp of approval on this. And that is really why it's so important, because you're not just a doctor, you're a part of me. And if you say, yes, it's okay, then we have 100% confidence in what you're about to tell this community.
And it's interesting because it's not just you. There's been a lot of research done on vaccine hesitancy and what groups are at risk for it and who they trust. And it shows that even, outside of our community, people trust their friends, their family, and their doctors, their personal doctors, even more than, for example, an Anthony Fauci. It's been shown. So that's why, again, I'm thanking you for the platform, because I do realize how important it is for folks to hear from, their family.
And speaking of family, we just had our brother, Pastor Leo Colon, enter the room. Pastor Leo, how are you this afternoon?
I am well, thank you. Thank you so much for allowing me to come on here and Bogart, Dr. Holcomb, his thing. I can't let him have nothing. So
never a Bogart with you, Pastor Lee.
Bogart please excuse me. You know, Kevin Holcomb's a dear friend and a bruh. I'm not going to spill none of the secrets, you know, that I have, and none of the craziness about Kevin, because, you know, he's a big, you know, he's a big muckety muck is what he is.
Time is limited.
Okay. Should I keep that segment? Because I can keep that in if you want.
It's fine with me.
He's a muckety muck. He's a big muckety muck, this guy. He is now doing commercials, you know, doctor/actor. It's wonderful. It's a beautiful thing. You know,
I haven't gotten, this is my first speaking part. You know, they're finally letting me out the box to speak.
No,
so,
you actually speak on the Presbyterian commercial. You speak on there.
Not on that commercial.
I have it on video.
No, you know what it is? You're right. There are certain things that they've done online that I have spoken on. I was referring to the TV spot. But in any case.
Man, congratulations on everything that's happening for you. You're now a Dean of Admissions.
Yeah, thank you, man. Thank you.
Congratulations to you. I think it's fantastic. I'm so, as we say in church, I'm so godly proud of you.
Thank you.
It's a long way from, you know, when we used to be on the phone together in college and you being upset that you got an A as opposed to an A+.
Well, I would tell you, I don't need to tell either of you guys, but God has been good.
Indeed.
All the time.
Indeed. And Kevin and I have been friends since 19. Don't worry about it. And as well as being an amazing physician and scientist, he's also one heck of a saxophone player. And we think,
yes.
Well, thank you. I that's part of my retirement plan. I'm telling you. I'm gonna
take you on the road.
I'm gonna get back into it.
Definitely.
I'm gonna take you on the road with me, man. And just, you know.
I miss that, Kevin. I really do miss that. So,
you're not alone. So do I.
So, gentlemen,
yes.
Let's jump into this, because now that I feel that I have two very important men in my life on the line that are going to really assist with me driving this home to our family. This subject is terribly important, and there's so much misinformation surrounding it. And with the two of you, I know that I'll be able to get the information out that is needed to our communities. So I'm going to start with this. There are 23 million cases in the United States as of date that are the coronavirus. We have had 400,000 deaths due to misinformation and mishandling. And now we have a vaccine that some people believe was developed overnight. Now, doctor, one of the things that I feel that we need to address is the fact that this vaccine was in the making long before this strain of COVID-19 and the others that have followed have come into the United States. So we need to address that, because that's part of the problem. A lot of people are not taking this vaccine because they think it was made overnight. Another factor, I'm just going to lay several points at your feet, and then I would like you to run with it.
No,
another factor is pregnancy, erectile dysfunction, allergies, who should be taking it, who shouldn't be taking it, the fact that the vaccine has mRNA, RNA, and what the spike proteins, there's a lot of information here that's floating around, but it's not the correct information being handled in the correct way. So now that I've put the basis of the fears out there, I'm going to step back and let you run with it. And Pastor Leo, you're here because we follow your community as a church. So I want to hear what you have to say with the whole thing as well.
Okay, so let's do that. Thank you. I wanted to put in for another issue, though. There's another fear that has nothing to do with science, And that is, as a community of African Americans, there's a legitimate fear of trusting anything regarding government with regard to our health. And specifically in the recent past, we're talking about the Tuskegee experiments, where African American men were given syphilis by the government to supposedly see, how they would react, and they were basically people who were watching them die, as if watching them die was something scientific. There is a fear of I know people who are like, I don't care what the science say, I'm not taking anything from them. And it's not really without merit. It's not without merit. We've trusted our government before, and these things have been happening. I'm not saying that it's the safest thing for us to adapt as far as a paradigm, but there's some other serious issues there that have nothing to do with medicine, and we think that's something we need to attack as well.
No, I have to say, in my practice and my conversations with people, the first thing that I want to get across is that vaccine hesitancy is completely understandable for all the reasons that you mentioned. That when you look at, especially people in our community, they are vaccine hesitant. They are not anti-vaccine folks for the most part. And I think the hesitancy does come from a history that goes all the way back to slavery time, of African Americans being the source of experimentation for the progress of medicine. But I think it's important that we really understand the facts in our history. And it's funny, Pastor Leo, I had a conversation with my mother the other day about Tuskegee experiment. And she brought up the same thing, because unfortunately, I wish Tuskegee was the only example of this happening. It's the most well-known. Exactly. So most people turn to it. Mm-hmm. But I'm always surprised to see how few people understand exactly what happened in that experiment. That experiment spanned almost the entire 20th century. It started in like 1930 at Tuskegee, and they wanted not to infect, they never infected Black men with syphilis. The horror of Tuskegee was that they got a group of men who were already infected with syphilis to follow them over time to find out what's the natural history of that infection. What happens to people? Because syphilis can start off in one part of your body, and in the end, it can get to your brain, it causes long-term problems, and then you can die of it. Mm-hmm. And this study was a longitudinal study to watch men over decades to see what happens. This is what happened in the middle of the study. A cure for syphilis came out. Penicillin came out, and they realized penicillin cures syphilis. They did not want those men to ever find out that there was a cure for syphilis, because they had already invested decades into the study. And if they wouldn't even let these men sign up for service in the military. Wow. Because they knew if they signed up, they would find out. Mm-hmm. So the irony of Tuskegee being brought up in this situation is that the horror of Tuskegee was that there was a medical intervention that was withheld from Black men. Mm-hmm. Our vaccine hesitancy may have us do to our own community what the government did to us in the 1930s and 40s. Exactly. And so if you understand, in that situation, that was them withholding a treatment. Here, there is a potential treatment, and I want to get into all the reasons for hesitancy about that, but the corollary would be us withholding this treatment from ourselves. So I just want to go back to something that Esther mentioned. It did seem like vaccine development happened like this in this situation. And it was developed with the help of the government. And it was called Operation Warp Speed. I mean, all that is poor publicity. I mean, that just sets people up for thinking they're going to be cutting corners on safety here. But I just want to tell you what Operation Warp Speed really was. One, before Operation Warp Speed, there was something called the Emergency Use Authorization Program, a rapid development for, in the middle of a public health emergency, you could get approval of not just medications, but even equipment, things like that, that could be rapidly deployed in the face of a public health emergency. Typically, when you have a vaccine developed, it takes so long because a big portion of the research is trying to figure out what part of that virus elicits the best immune response. A virus, whether it's RNA, DNA, whatever it is, there's all these different parts of the virus, and you don't know what's the part that will allow your body to see it the best. because this is not our first dance with the coronavirus. Coronavirus has caused the SARS outbreak in 1993. I'm sorry, yeah, 1993. Coronavirus caused the MERS outbreak. So one thing that people knew was that the thing that our body responded to the best was what's called the spike protein. Mm-hmm. And everybody has seen a picture of the coronavirus with the spikes hanging out of it. That corona means crown. And so it looks like a crown around this virus. That spike protein is what attaches to your cells and gets inside of your cells. And it turns out that if you could get your body to respond in an immunologic way to the spike protein, you could prevent COVID-19. I want to explain the difference between SARS infection and COVID-19, because I think that's important. The virus that's caused this problem, it started in Wuhan. I think we all remember hearing this weird thing was happening in China. Mm-hmm. Nobody knew exactly what it was. Mm-hmm. When it got identified what it was, that it was a new type of coronavirus. It had some things in common with the original SARS, but it was different in enough ways that they called it SARS-2. So SARS-2-CoV was just severe acute respiratory syndrome coronavirus 2. It was the second time we've seen it. Lots of people can get this infection and not have any symptoms. But if you get the infection and you get symptoms, you get fever, pneumonia, all these things, you know it better than anyone, Pastor Leo, that's COVID-19.
And I might add that Pastor Leo actually lived through this virus. We should let our audience know that.
Well, and he's a survivor, and thank God for it. But the fact of the matter is, most people survive even if they have a symptomatic infection. Most people with COVID-19 survive. It's only about what we think is about a 1% to 2% mortality rate. And that may be even on the high side. So the majority of people survive it. But the work on a vaccine to develop against coronavirus, this novel coronavirus, we already knew that if it was going to be effective, it would be directed against the spike protein. That saved years of preclinical research time. Then the other thing that we should realize, for example, you take the Pfizer vaccine. Pfizer went into a collaboration with a small biotech firm called BioNTech. They were from Germany, actually founded by two Turkish immigrants who had working in a real small operation. But they had figured out this new technology years ago called messenger RNA vaccines and had been working on Ebola, Zika. They were waiting for an opportunity. They were waiting for what they call disease X, this opportunity when they would be able to use their technology and be able to rapidly develop a vaccine. So a lot of the platform of the messenger RNA vaccines for both Moderna and Pfizer were already developed. What did they need? They needed a new disease to go after. And all they needed to be able to build their vaccine was the genetic code of the part of the virus that elicits the best immune response. China hid a lot of the information on what was going on. I mean, they were not very forthcoming in the beginning, but one of the things that they did do, Chinese scientists let the world know the sequence, the genetic sequence of that virus in January of 2020. All these companies, it was a race. It started then. All these companies had the genetic code. They were able to plug it into the platforms they already had, and they were able to develop vaccines in some cases within a month because all that other work had already been done. Mm-hmm. All they needed, they call it plug and play technology. Normally, you do what's called a phase 1 study. It's a study on just safety. A phase 2 study, does it actually work? And then a phase 3 study where you compare it against a placebo. The FDA normally makes you do them in tandem. And then it costs a lot of money to do these studies. So companies don't invest in the platform to make it in any grand level until they're sure that they've gotten approval. And they make them hand in all the information together. You do your phase 1, your phase 2, your phase 3, you give it to the FDA, and it's only after they give you approval are you gonna then pour in all this money to have manufacturing capability. What Warp Speed did was the government partnered with 6 different companies and said, we're gonna help you. We will guarantee you, we'll buy 100 million doses from you if it works. If it works and you get approval from the FDA, you don't have to worry about the production. We will help you produce it because we need it done rapidly. That knocked down a lot of barriers that we normally see. The emergency use authorization system also allowed what's called rolling review. The companies didn't have to wait phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 and give it all. They were able to give the data to the FDA as it was coming out. That overlapped a lot of things. They did the phase 1 and phase 2 overlap. They did the phase 2 and phase 3 overlap. They condensed this, but the safety standards, the same standards that the FDA holds for everything else, for every other vaccine, it was the same. I also want to say something about distrust of the government. The one company that didn't take a dollar from the Trump administration for the development of their vaccine was Pfizer. Pfizer actually won the race and came to market first. And the only money they took from the Trump administration was money to help with distribution and production. Not a dollar went to making the vaccine. Moderna partnered with our NIH, the National Institutes of Health, and they were working together to develop the Moderna vaccine. What's unknown for a lot of people is that there were Black women who are leading both of these efforts. Pfizer's lead for rollout of the clinical study, their phase 3 study, there was a woman named Judith Absalon. A Black woman was the lead on that study. The basic science part for the NIH Moderna collaboration, there's a Black woman named Kizzy Corbett who led that effort. So a lot of people don't realize that Black people have played a role in this. And then when you look at the conduct of the studies, we were on those studies in a way that we're typically not on FDA trials. We were 10% of the populations in both of those studies. It really says all those prior FDA approvals that were given on drugs with hardly any Black people on the studies, because they said, well, Black people won't go on trials because of Tuskegee, because of distrust. Black people don't enroll in trials. Not true. I never believed it. It shows now that it's not true. They carried out 2 large trials in record time with large participation of Latinx and Black people on those trials. So I just want to say we played a role in the development of these drugs. We were represented in the conduct of the trials. And now if I can move on to what the trials actually showed, because I think a lot of people don't understand how the trials were done. What they did was basically 1-to-1, and they're large trials. We're talking about probably about 40,000 people on the Pfizer trial and about 30,000 on Moderna. Half the people getting placebo, and the other half, or just a sugar, just saline basically injection. The other half actually getting the vaccine. They sent these people out into the world. Unfortunately, the reason why these trials got done so fast was that the disease was rampant in our communities at the time they were doing the study. It didn't take long for a lot of people to get infected. So when you're looking to see the difference between who got infected and sick from the placebo and who got infected and sick from the vaccine, what they saw was that, for example, for Pfizer, there were only 8 people out of like 20,000 people who got the vaccine who ended up getting COVID-19. But in the people who, 8 out of 20,000. When you looked at the people who got the placebo, it was 162 out of that group. So that's how they came up with 95% efficacy. Moderna's similar numbers. I want to clarify, the endpoint of those studies were not whether you got the infection, it was whether you got sick from the infection. And that's important because that's still a question mark. Does it prevent you from getting the infection in the first place? Could you take the vaccine and still get the infection and pass it on to someone else? That's still a question mark. But I can say to anybody who takes the vaccine, the efficacy says that you just decreased your chance of getting sick from COVID-19 by like 94, 95%.
Let me ask you a question, and I, I'm sorry, Esther, you didn't ask me to be co-host, but
I did, I certainly did. Go ahead.
Let me ask you a question. What I think I'm hearing you saying is one of the reasons why that it did not take 18 months to 2 years to 3 years to get this done was that the methodology was already in place. Is that what I hear you saying?
I would say a lot of the basic science work that goes into developing a vaccine, they had already rounded all the bases. They were on third base trying to get to home. And all they needed was the vaccine, the virus DNA code, and that code was released to everybody in the world in January of last year.
Now we have this question, and this is pure. This is question as in for the community as well as selfish one for me. Is there a consensus that people like me who have lived through it, who I actually went, I had to go get some, went to a funeral and then had to go and get some more COVID tests done, was negative. But at the same time, I got the antibody test done as well. And it came back to like 99.5 something, which I have no idea, no context to understand that. But my question is, those of us who have lived through it, have been infected, should we be also looking forward to taking it as well?
Yeah, and I will tell you that what we know, and everything's prefaced by they call this a novel coronavirus for a reason. It's new, right? So all this clinical experience comes from millions and millions of people who have gotten infected worldwide, but there's not a lot of long-term experience with this virus. What we do know at this point is that the chances of you getting infected again after already getting over a coronavirus infection within the first 90 days is rare. There have been cases of people who have been infected twice. Any natural immunity to a natural exposure can have a waning of the protection.
Okay.
I mean, the common cold is a great example, right? A lot of common colds are coronaviruses. Just because you got a cold in 2020 does not mean that you're not going to get a cold again in 2021. And it doesn't have to be a different virus. So natural immunity can wane over time.
Okay.
Immunization immunity can wane over time. So the question is, well, how long will the shot last? A lot of people wonder, well, I got my 2 shots. Does this mean I need a booster in a year or a year from then? Or you don't know until you see people who got vaccinated start developing disease. And the only way you're going to know that is to follow people who were originally on that trial after you already got approval. So all those people who were on the Pfizer and the Moderna trial, they're being followed for the next 2 years. Those trials are not over. If those people start getting more infection, then we will know, well, this seems to be the time. What we need is what they call a correlate of protection. You got an antibody test and they gave you a number and you said, I don't know what it means. Guess what, Leo? Nobody knows what it means, because what we need to know is what number did you have to drop below that we know that you're at risk.
Okay.
In some cases, you can immunize somebody, they get protective antibodies. The antibodies go back down to pre-immunization levels, and yet they're still protected. That's what we see with the human papillomavirus vaccine. That's a vaccine in my area. I'm a gynecologic oncologist, so I'm familiar with that vaccine. We've seen for years now that some women who took the HPV vaccine as young women or teenagers, if you tested their blood, it looks like they're no longer protected. And yet we don't see them developing HPV infections or precancers of their cervix. They're still protected. So we don't have for that vaccine a correlate of protection. It might be lifelong. You may never need a booster. What I'm concerned about with coronaviruses is that RNA is unstable, RNA mutates, and you're starting to see the global impact of that happening. Viruses can't, yes.
Let's deal with the RNA and the mRNA. Could we be a little more specific as to exactly what those initials represent? Because I think that throws a lot of our community as well.
It's confusing,
they don't understand what that is.
So, and I totally get the confusion, because DNA, messenger RNA, transfer RNA, they all sound so similar. So let me give you an analogy of a bank. So your DNA, every cell has the complete recipe for everything that your body can make in its genetic code. That DNA, that precious store of information, is kept in the nucleus of the cell. Let's say if we were in a bank, that would be the vault. When you need to make a protein, you then do that from a transcript of the DNA. So the DNA is then transcribed or translated into what's called messenger RNA. Messenger RNA leaves the vault. It goes into the cytoplasm, the outside of the outside the nucleus, and it gets translated into the protein. Messenger RNA never goes back the other way. Messenger RNA has a one-way street. It goes from the nucleus to the cytoplasm. It doesn't go from the cytoplasm to the nucleus. A messenger RNA vaccine, really the genius of it is, up until now, what we've done since smallpox was to expose people to proteins that their body has never seen. You can inject the protein in somebody's arm, and they will then have an allergic immune response to it. Mm-hmm. But a messenger RNA vaccine gave your cell the messenger RNA transcript for you to make the protein on its own. It used your body's machinery to produce the protein itself, as opposed to just giving you the protein. So a lot of people say, well, messenger RNA can change my genetic code. I've heard people ask me, will it change my DNA? No, because messenger RNA can't go into the nucleus. It can't, it's not DNA. It can't incorporate into your DNA. Its job is done in the cytoplasm. That's where it gets used, and then it's done. It gets translated. Your body makes spike protein, and then spike protein does what it normally does. It goes to the surface and spikes out. So now your cells have that same identifying feature of coronavirus and allows your immune system to see it as foreign, and all the same responses as if you had the same virus. You don't need the virus to elicit it. All you need is the spike protein. You can't get coronavirus from the vaccine because it's only teaching your body how to make the spike protein. Nothing else. You're not getting an injection of the vaccine. So this is not even a killed or weakened virus. It's just the genetic code to make one aspect of it. But that aspect of it is the thing that your body recognizes the best. So this is, as you had stated from the beginning, this is not really new technology. Messenger RNA vaccine technology has been around for decades, but this is the first time it's gotten authorization in the United States.
So Dr. Holcomb, with these new strains that are appearing, are we going to get the same response in having already taken the vaccine? Will it respond the same way, or do we need a new, stronger dosage to fight the newer strains?
And that is what everybody's concerned about now. And we're starting to see it in the results of the newer vaccines. So when Moderna and Pfizer did their studies, you didn't, as far as we know, some of these variants that you're seeing from the UK or South Africa weren't really predominant at the time. Viruses mutate, and they mutate when they're inside of a cell. So the more opportunities a virus has to jump from person to person, you get more mutations. Mm-hmm. So if you think of a vaccine as a mugshot, it's a picture. If I had robbed a bank, the same bank I was telling you about, I rob it, and then I get a mugshot taken of me, and I break out of jail the next day. And let's say all I do is put on some sunglasses, and I think I'm going to walk around the streets, even though all the cops have my picture, and I think they're not going to see me because I got on these sunglasses. That would be like the spike protein having one mutation. Most cops are going to say, that's the guy. He's got on sunglasses, but that's him. They're going to pick me up. But let's say I put on sunglasses and a mustache and maybe a fake nose. It might take a more astute cop to notice and say, that's the same guy. I'm going to respond. What we're seeing is that the coronavirus is starting to put on some costumes. These mutations are starting to get to a point where your immune system has been vaccinated against this type, but now it's got a fake mustache. So no one knows, when do you get to a point where you can't neutralize that vaccine anymore? But we're starting to get some ideas. So Johnson & Johnson hasn't been approved yet for their vaccine, but you might have seen in the news that they carried out their study in 3 places. They did it in the US, they did it in South America, and they did it in South Africa. And they came up with totally different efficacy measurements in all 3 places. It was the most effective in preventing COVID in the US, 72%. It was the least effective in South Africa. It was only about 50-something%. But I think a lot of people saw that and said, well, this means it doesn't work. But that's missing the point of, when you looked at its prevention of hospitalization and getting really sick, Johnson & Johnson was 85% effective no matter what strain you had. And so I think it's important to see that, yes, it seems like we're going to need boosters going forward. And this is a foot race. Can we get enough Americans vaccinated so we can get herd immunity and keep this thing from being able to jump from person to person, slow down this change rate so this virus can't keep on putting on costumes? We might not need a booster. But the way things are going, the companies are already producing boosters. They're already in the lab. They're not waiting to find out. So the beauty of messenger RNA vaccine technology is that it doesn't take long to do it. They came up with this one in 42 days. The vaccine itself took longer to test it. If you need to do a booster, you just need to plug in a new messenger RNA. And so with that plug and play technology, we can respond much faster now. You guys probably know that for the flu vaccine every year, we start planning for the next year way in advance because the technology is so slow. So they've got to predict what's going to be the predominant flu strain. And sometimes we're right, and sometimes we're completely wrong. And you see the efficacy of the flu vaccine going up and down because of it. If we need a booster, which I think eventually we will, they're already going to have it. They just have to figure out what is the predominant strain that we need to now immunize people against. And then you just change the messenger RNA. And, you know, could this be something like the flu vaccine? As a physician, I have to take the flu vaccine every year. It's slightly different every year because of this prediction. So we've done this before. If we have to do this over and over for coronavirus, I'm not that concerned about that, to be honest. I think what I'm concerned about is this. The United States is not doing the work that other countries are doing to do surveillance of genetic sequencing of viruses. And I'm hoping, not to be political, but I'm hoping under a new administration that has its, you know, focus in the right places, that we're going to go ahead and put all those things back in place, because we're getting information secondhand. It's the UK telling us, hey, we've got a new variant that's causing trouble. South Africa telling us, hey, we've got a variant that's a problem. We're not picking it up because we're only sequencing about 2% of the virus cases that we have. They're doing a much higher percentage.
And Dr. Holcomb, that was a very important issue that you just presented. Prior to the previous administration that just left, we had these fail-safes in place. In fact, the CDC was one of the priorities in the past 3 administrations before 45 left. So I think had it not been for that, we would have been ahead of the game on this whole issue. But I want to just shift gears ever so slightly and speak to the subject of children. Why is it that the children are not being affected in the way that we're seeing adults being affected with this virus in general?
Honestly, I'll be honest with you that I don't know the answer to that question. And I don't think anybody knows the answer to that question, because with children, what you see is the majority of them don't get affected. But when they do, they get this inflammatory response that is a major inflammatory response and deadly. And so it's like 0 or 100 with kids. It's very rare to see a child get very sick, but when they do, they get very sick. And the other thing I don't think anybody knows, and we're learning more about long haul syndrome in adults, is what are the long-term effects of coronavirus infection in children? I mean, this idea that it's nothing in children, they're going to be fine, I don't think we really know. There will be studies on children with the vaccines that are out now and the new ones that are coming out. They did their initial trials. Pfizer started at 16. Moderna started at 18. Nobody did children yet. But they're going back, and we're probably going to get to this topic, but for example, pregnant women were not allowed on the original trials. They're now opening the trials for pregnant women. And so there are some really important groups that haven't been studied, but the companies wanted to get the studies done quickly and get some information out as quickly as possible. But there are going to be ongoing studies of groups who are at risk that have not been studied yet. Okay. You know, I just realized that one of the things I haven't addressed was safety concerns. And about the
we were
vaccine.
Getting to that.
It just hit me that we talked about efficacy, and I don't think that's what most people have a question about.
Well, the questions that I've been getting, a lot of the listeners that have lupus have been writing in and asking, can you ask about that? That's one thing that I wanted to speak about. And also the ones who have extreme allergies, because there is a glycinol protein that if you've had it in your system, you're more prone to having the allergy response to the injection. and the injection has a response within the first 10 to 20 minutes, if you don't have the allergic response to the injection at that point, then you probably don't have to worry about it. Are all of those things true?
So let me, the first question was about lupus.
Yes.
So the studies that were done, and right now we still only have 2 approved vaccines that both happen to be messenger RNA vaccines. In both of those trials, they didn't allow people on the trials if they were taking drugs that suppress your immune system. So having lupus alone was not enough to keep you off the trial. Having lupus and you're taking an immunosuppressant was enough.
Mm-hmm.
If you were on active chemotherapy, you could not get on the trial. It was not thought that there was a safety concern. No one thought that they were going to be more at risk for having a side effect. They weren't allowed on because there was a concern that they may not mount as robust a response. If your immune system is being suppressed because you're taking a medication, you have an autoimmune disease like lupus, you have a kidney transplant, you're taking a medication, you're on chemo, it's knocking your immune system down, and now you're expecting your immune system to give you this robust response and make all these antibodies to protect you. The concern was if you do your first trial with a lot of these people who have less efficacy, you might water down the response and not be able to see the true effectiveness. And so they decided to leave these groups off. The problem with some of this is that, for example, with chemo patients, there's some data showing that these are high-risk patients. Their immune suppression puts them at high risk for a bad outcome from COVID. And yet they were not studied on these 2 trials. And they have to make a decision. If they come up, their number gets called, do you want the vaccine or not? They have to make a decision. And I can tell you in the case of chemo patients, because as an oncologist, I had to face this. The American, there's a group called the NCCN. It's a major group, the National Clinical, it's a national group of clinical oncology recommendations. Another group called the American Society of Clinical Oncology. They have said, if you're on chemo and your chance comes up, you should take the vaccine. Because even if you don't have as robust a response as somebody else might have, some response is better than none. You weren't off the study because they were concerned that it would be less safe for you. You were off the study because they were concerned it would be less effective. So if your number gets called, you should take it.
So
pregnant women, yeah. Sorry.
Let's step back just ever so slightly to the lupus patients again, because I'm seeing them come up on another screen. Is it the Plaquenil that was preventing? If they were on Plaquenil, that's why they couldn't take the
Exactly. It wasn't the disease lupus that was the problem. It was the fact that they were taking immunosuppressant medication.
And wasn't that medication one of the ones that was being used in the beginning, or told that we should be using in the beginning to help bring the virus down in the system?
Yeah. You know, the sad thing about it is, and the reason why you're not hearing this spoken about much, in the beginning, we were hopeful that we were going to have a vaccine someday. I don't think anybody thought they'd be as effective or would happen as fast. And everything was about therapeutics. We were going to get out of this because we were going to come up with medications that if you got sick, they'll give you this medication, you'll get out of the hospital. Hydroxychloroquine was pushed for a while. Convalescent plasma, remdesivir, steroids, Plaquenil, all these things were tried. And the truth is, we really, other than giving people blood thinners and steroids, everything else really hasn't proven to be that effective. I mean, some of these other interventions have shown to reduce the hospitalization time by a couple of days, but we've been much more effective with vaccinations than we've been effective with therapeutics. And I think some of the distrust that happened amongst the community, in my opinion, and I'm speaking for myself here, is that the FDA and the CDC gave emergency authorization use to a few of these therapeutics with less data than we normally would have done. And I think, in my opinion, I think they were under some pressure from the administration and they bent. And I think when the vaccines were coming out, they realized because we bent in the past and we've lost some trust, we better get our trust back and we better stop pushing back. And that's when Steve Hahn, Fauci, I think that's when everybody really started pushing back because they realized we keep bending like this, nobody's going to take the vaccine when it comes out.
Question. Thank you so much for all this information. Because one of the things that, and you just mentioned the hydrochloroquine and all this other kind of stuff. When I was sick in ICU, one of the things, two of the distinctions or nuances that I kept hearing was the issue of treatment versus vaccine. Right. Vaccine and treatment are two different things.
Two totally different things.
And they were saying that it is very possible and plausible that we would get a vaccine before we get a treatment. Because one of the things they kept saying to me was, we're not treating COVID because we don't have a treatment. What we're doing, and what you're saying is exactly what they did to me. They gave me blood thinners and steroids. And they said, all we're doing is trying by hook or by crook to keep your lungs working. Mm-hmm. So that's what that was. Speak to when do we think we can get a treatment, and what does that mean, treatment versus vaccine? Because I've also, in talking to other people, you know, the young man who has started his residency, and he was talking to me a bit about this kind of stuff. Bacteria and viruses are different in the way you treat them. Yeah. Which is to say, viruses, is it plausible that there may never be a treatment for a virus like there's no treatment for the common cold?
Right, right. And so I'm going to step back to the difference between a vaccine and a therapeutic. A vaccine is meant to prevent you from ever getting sick in the first place.
Okay.
If you've got a really effective vaccine, you actually don't need a therapeutic.
Okay.
Best way to handle a disease is to prevent it, right? If you had 100% prevention, you would never need a treatment for it. A therapeutic is for somebody who, for whatever reason, ended up getting sick because maybe they weren't vaccinated or they didn't get the same response and now they're sick. What are you going to give them once they already have an established infection? The difference between bacteria and viruses is that viruses get inside your cells. They're intracellular pathogens. They get inside your cell. Bacteria don't. Bacteria stay outside. Antibiotics are the treatment for bacteria. Antivirals are the treatment for viruses.
Okay.
We've just been much better at treating bacteria. So people used to die of bacterial infections all the time. We've just been, and we're starting to see some lack of efficacy in our antibiotics because now we're getting these multi-drug resistant antibiotics because we've been using the same ones for years. So we're seeing an emerging problem, but we've always had a problem with viruses. We've never been that good with viruses. And so trying to attack a pathogen that's gotten inside your cell has proved much harder than killing something that stays outside of it.
The issue with regard to herd immunity, and this is part of my last question. I always thought herd immunity was defined as enough people get the virus so that there is an immunity built up because so many of us have it and so But I never thought herd immunity was an issue after there's a vaccine. I thought a vaccine was to prevent people from getting it, and if not enough people are getting it. So what's wrong with my definition of what herd immunity is?
What's wrong with your definition is that you think you can only reach, your definition assumes that you can only reach herd immunity through natural immunity. But a vaccination is just, in fact, in almost all cases, it's better than a natural infection. When people get coronavirus on their own and they make antibodies, they don't make anywhere near the number of antibodies as they do when they get a vaccine. Okay. So herd immunity you reach when a virus needs to hop from host to host to stay alive. A virus is, you get, if you have a deadly virus, it could burn out so fast before you even get a chance to have a pandemic because it kills everybody it touched. So Ebola can pop up sometimes, kill lots of people in a limited area. We've never had an effective Ebola vaccine. It just dies out and then it pops up someplace else. But if you have a virus like coronavirus, this novel one, the danger of it is that it spreads while somebody doesn't have symptoms. So people, before they have a fever, before they're coughing, they're actually most infectious then. But if you have let's say if vaccines prevent primary infection, and you then have a number of people where you're walking down the street, coughing, sneezing, you don't believe in masks, you're not wearing a mask, but that virus can't find it into anybody else's cells. The virus is stuck. It can't go anyplace. And that's called herd immunity. There's enough people around you that the virus has no place to go. So there's this concept called R naught. You see R with a little zero. How many people get infected by one person being infected? Is it one other person on average? Is it two on average? Well, when you get R naught to zero, you say, well, somebody gets infected and they can't infect anybody around them because they're all immunized. You've got herd immunity. Mm-hmm. What I'm going to be honest, this is something that infectious disease doctors can speak much more informed about. But it seems like for some diseases, you can get herd immunity with like 60, 70% of the population immune. And other diseases, you need like 90%. Like measles, you need like 92% of people immune to measles. So when it becomes a fad not to immunize your child, like happened in California, happened, I think, in upstate New York, you just have a few parents not immunize their child, and all of a sudden you got a measles outbreak. You don't have much cushion. You drop below 92%, you get an outbreak. And I'm not sure with coronavirus, what's that percentage? And I've heard different people give different numbers. In the beginning, they were saying like 60, 70%. But I've noticed over time, I hear specialists in this area, that number seems to be bumping up. They're saying, I think we're probably going to be in the range of a 90% that you're going to need immune to this before we reach herd.
Okay. So Dr. Holcomb, first to begin with, let me tell you, I appreciate every single word. And I know I sat back and let you just run with it, but I thought that was extremely important, because when people turn on their televisions or listening to their radios or watching it on their computers, they get this bombarded influx of information, and a lot of it is misinformation. And as I said in the beginning, I trust your words, and I trust your profession, and I trust you. So I wanted to provide that space where you could just comfortably talk to the family and give them the needed information.
As do I.
I'm going to ask, thank you, Pastor. I'm going to ask 3 more questions, and then we're going to bring it home, because these are some of the more basic questions that I get on a regular basis. Well, ESP, when I take the injection, which one should I take? And I have several family members who should be taking it and who should not be taking it.
So the first question I get asked all the time, and the misunderstanding there is that you will get called and you'll go into the center and say, well, where's the Moderna line? I've decided I want Moderna today. I don't want to stand on the Pfizer line. I wasn't given a choice. I showed up at my hospital. I'm phase 1A. I'm a healthcare provider on the front line. So I was in the first group that got immunized. My hospital had both Pfizer and Moderna. I showed up on a Thursday. It was Moderna day. I got Moderna. So people are not necessarily getting a choice. So my big answer to the question is, whatever they're handing out that day, you should go get it. I mean, even if people is like, well, I see Johnson & Johnson, their preliminary data looks less effective than Moderna. I'm like, all of them have life-saving potential. All of them are better than walking around with nothing. So I would say whatever you have access to, you should get. If you look at the efficacy, 95, 94%, and let me step back to say, before they started doing these trials, the FDA said to the companies, we will help you produce this and distribute it if you're effective. What's the definition of effective? They said you got to have over 50% reduction in the risk of COVID-19. The yearly flu vaccine is about 40. It's somewhere between 40 and 50% effective. So you may say 50% sounds low. That's only because we got spoiled, and the first 2 vaccines that came out had 95% efficacy. But if you think you can look at 95% for Pfizer and 94.1% for Moderna and say that those are different, I'm going to go for the 95 versus the 94.1, that you're kidding yourself. They're no different. They're the same. And then what you have to be fair to the newer vaccines coming out, they're testing their vaccines in a different playing field. They're testing their vaccines against the UK variant, the South African variant, and had Pfizer and Moderna had to test their vaccines in the same playing field, I don't know if you would have seen them hit 94, 95% either. So I think this it's oversimplified for people to look at the overall efficacy and think that they can make an informed decision and say, I only want this, I only want that. Some vaccines, for example, Johnson & Johnson will eventually apply, I'm sure, for their emergency use authorization. It doesn't have to be refrigerated to the same degree as messenger RNA. It's a single dose. There's going to be parts of the world where that is very attractive.
Right.
There's going to be parts of this country where that's very attractive. There's people living out in, Native American reservations. That cold chain storage of trying to get a messenger RNA vaccine out to them is not really realistic.
Yes.
Right. And so, which one is right for you has a lot to do with where do you live, what's going on in your neighborhood. But I would say, don't say no to any of them if you have the opportunity to be vaccinated.
Which brings us to the next level of thought. Pastor Leo.
Yes.
You have become the vehicle as ministers to now take all of this pertinent information that the doctors have been trying to get us to clearly see and accept. You now have been laden with the job of putting it out into the communities and adding to the truth and making it more comfortable. So as a minister, when offered by whatever company or whatever faction or whatever city agency that is going to allow you to administer these vaccines through your church, will you do it?
In a hot minute, I'm looking forward to an opportunity to do that. Kevin, if you guys need a place to do that in community, we could, I could certainly, not only with my church, but get in touch with other churches and do that. We had one church, pastor in Long Island, who opened up their community center to have people in the community come and get vaccinated. And I thought that was absolutely fabulous. And so I'm looking for an excuse to do the same thing. So I would do that. One of the best ways that I could do that too is for me to take the vaccine. I certainly haven't been called on to do that yet. When I do, I promise you, I will be front and center and do that. And Esther, seriously, as you have articulated before, in a large part, my comfortability with it is because people like Kevin have, I follow him on social media. He's actually put it out there saying, I'm taking it. I've done, the critical thinking with regard to looking at the science. If I look at the science, they can sit there and tell me, the Johnson rod needs to be put in the carburetor, and I wouldn't know what was happening, but he knows what they're talking about. And because, I know Kevin to be a person of integrity, that since high school, he's wanted to do this and has always wanted to do it the right way and has done it the right way. If he says it's good, that's all the assurance I need. And so basically,
I just want to say one thing though. As a physician, when I'm dealing with patients with cancer, my job is not to get them to do what I'm recommending.
Okay.
My job is to give them all the information that they need to make an informed decision. And to be honest, I don't really, I have colleagues who feel really, really bad if they can't get somebody to do exactly what they want. But I'm humble enough and I'm informed enough that I've seen medicine swing back and forth on a lot of things. We say one thing one day and we're saying something else, 10 years later, not because we're whimsical, because the information came in and we changed our mind on that. So I've got to live with the fact that I'm telling people that in 2021, I've looked at this science and it's a no-brainer for me. I think you should be immunized. And yet I have to keep with me the knowledge that maybe there's a long-term side effect that people will find out about 10 years from now. And they'll look back and they'll say, but Kevin HOLCOMB said it was safe. Right. Well, based on what I have in my hands right now, it is a no-brainer. The risk of going uncovered in a pandemic that has killed 1 in 1,000 Americans and an even higher number of Black Americans there's no, to me, you can't even weigh the things that people are raising. I didn't address this, but you mentioned allergic reactions. Yes, you can have an anaphylactic reaction to this. You can have a dangerous allergic reaction, and every site that's given this vaccine has to follow CDC guidance of what has to be on site in case this happens. But in over 2 million, in the first 26 million doses that were given, in the first 2 million doses of the vaccine that were given, there were like 26 anaphylactic reactions, 26 and 2 million doses. So I think, you have to inform people about the risk, but it's really important to put it in perspective and say your perception of risk and your actual risk may be very, very different. People take bigger risks in their daily lives all the time. But what they perceive as a risk, what scares them the most, sometimes it takes a conversation that says, look, these are the numbers. I know how you feel about it. And especially when you have a politicized medical emergency. I can tell you, you take politics and a medical emergency and put them together, you're going to see death follow. It's never going to work out well. And so I totally respect if somebody decides not to vaccinate themselves. That is their body, that is their call.
Yeah.
I just want to make sure they see the data I see and get stripped of all the misinformation that has clouded this picture. Because I think once you pull all that back, reasonable people do reasonable things.
Sure.
Well, up until this point, I have been one of the resistors. It took my conversation with you to change my mind because I'm an EpiPen carrier. So my biggest fear was in taking the injection, I may be the one who has the allergic reaction. But in listening to you and going through the information and sitting and processing and doing the research for myself, I clearly understand that taking the vaccine outweighs the risks and what's happening to people who do not take it and the people who get the virus, because we're dying. And our section of people, our community of people are dying. So if my taking that vaccine serves as an example to push forward, then so be it. I need to take that vaccine.
Very often patients ask me, which I used to get insulted with this question, but I completely understand it now. You give them a plan of action and you say, and you go through the data with them and why you're saying chemo is better than radiation or why surgery is better than chemo. And they would say, well, what would you say if I was your mother or your wife? And I would say, why would you think that I would give you a different recommendation that I would give for somebody in my family? But suffice it to say, I'm bringing this up to say my mother is an EpiPen carrying some person with a history of anaphylaxis to shellfish. And my advice to her was get the vaccine, walk with your EpiPen, get treated in a place and ask before you get treated, did you guys follow the CDC guidance on what needs to be here in case somebody has anaphylaxis? Because I told her the guidance is one thing. You better confirm that they follow the rules because I don't think that the government has the army now to send out to every site that's immunizing and making sure. So I would say if you got an allergic reaction, bring your EpiPen and ask before you get your injection, do you guys have equipment available just in case? Make sure they do before you go forward. But my guess is that you'll get the answer yes, and you should move forward.
Okay. So final thoughts, gentlemen.
Listen, I know for me, the only context that I can speak from is I was in that ICU bed. And I understand that this is not a joke. This is not funny. The idea that, you know what, I'm going to play Russian roulette with my life and determine I'm not going to take the vaccine because of my distrust of certain things. I say that the distrust is valid. I get it, I understand. But I wouldn't wish on anyone to get this vaccine. This thing is real. I'm looking out the ICU window and watching nurses and doctors that are supposed to be watching me running up and down the hall 4 and 5 times a day. And every time they came back, somebody died or it was a danger. And for me, the anxiety of not being able to breathe, it was so real and so scary that if I could help you not have to go through that, I'm told, my church is still closed. I haven't opened it and it's 11 months now. But I am not about to put anyone through that by mistake or on purpose. And that for me is the kind of reason I'm saying whatever needs to be done to mitigate your ability to catch this infection, you really ought to do. And that's just a real concern for me. If I could help somebody stay out the hospital, I'll do what I can. Because that was scary.
Can I ask you a question, Pastor Leo?
Yes, sir.
If you had never had this personal experience,
Right.
how do you think you'd feel differently about this? Or
Yeah, come on. I mean, I could not possibly truly empathize with a cancer patient who has to go through. I had a friend of mine who I was working with when I was doing my staff accounting, and she had cancer and had gone through therapy and gone through chemo several times. And it went away like 2 or 3 times and it came back. And she had made a determination, I'm not doing the medicine this time. I'm not going through the chemo this time. I felt, I certainly didn't have the authority to tell her, no, you're going to do this. But it felt selfish to me because I've never been through it and I don't know. And for me, I can't say to her she's wrong because I've never been in her shoes. Now, having gone through having COVID and being in ICU and literally, I'm trying not to get emotional about it, but literally thinking that I was going to die and never again. My wife is Dorothy, by the way, for those who are watching may not know. You really can't put words, the lexicon is not enough for me to tell you what kind of fear I went through. This was real and this is scary. And that's something I had to go through. When I lost my baby, and Kevin was there by my side when I lost my baby, you have to go through these kinds of things to understand the utter helplessness that's involved in that kind of stuff. And if you can help somebody not to go through that, I absolutely see it as part of my job. That's the reason I'm here. There are other reasons as well, but I mean, but God knows, I have.
There are other reasons, yes.
Yeah. I mean,
well, in my profession, at the time the outbreak started, I was in the profession of breathing. We ran a CPR business and we saw firsthand in teaching paramedics how to be out in the field, in being in hospitals, running codes and making sure they stayed up to spec on what they were supposed to be doing. We were wearing N95s before N95s were deemed necessary while we were in the hospitals, my partner and I. So I saw this firsthand from the beginning, and also lost several family members, 3 brothers and sisters, to this dreaded virus. So anything that can help prevent, slow down, or pull back on this virus is something that I will do. And gentlemen, it has been an honor to have both of you here, Dr. Kevin HOLCOMB and Reverend Dr. Leo Colon. It has been an honor and a joy to have you both sitting with us today to share this information with the family. I hate to cut this conversation off, but we are pushing time. Unless I make it a 2-part series and you want to come back.
Well, I'm always open to it. And thank you for the opportunity. Leo, you were a pleasant surprise. It was really good to see you. I didn't know you were coming. Leo's not telling me, but I remember texting with him in the ICU. And I remember his sheer terror and how scary it was for me just texting back and forth with you. And so I felt like I sort of went through it a little bit with you myself.
Sure. We did. And that was, I'm telling you, that's a scary time to be in that bed. And, it's not funny. It's not okay. And it hurts me to hear some of the political dismissal of the real pain.
Well, I just want to say before we close that we have borne a disproportionate burden here. I think most people know that already. It wasn't obvious in the beginning, but by a month into the pandemic, by like April 9th, the CDC released that first data stratified by ethnicity that showed what we know now, that we were dying at almost 3 times the rate, which we continue to do, and getting infected at about the same difference. And it's not just because we have more obesity and hypertension. That's what everybody ran to first, which is true. But we also had more overcrowding. We had multi-generational living. We had much higher chance of being frontline workers. You look at people in the MTA, who's running hospitals, there are people who look like us who are out front keeping this country moving.
Very true.
And we took the brunt of this, and we're still taking the brunt of that. I look at this effort, and the reason why I'm speaking to you today and did a program yesterday, and I'm going to be doing another one next week, is because now there's a therapeutic intervention. We need to get this thing turned around. We have died at disproportionate rates, and we can't let vaccine hesitancy, uninformed hesitancy, keep pressing on that side. Because you know what? When we don't show up for our shot, you've seen it in the news. People will come down from Westchester to the Bronx to get your shot.
Absolutely.
People are jumping in front of you to get your shot.
And that is the tie-up. That is the tie-up. That's where we were going with this show. When I heard that piece of news, I said, no, we have to do something. For those of us who have these platforms, it's one thing to get on your platform and play and have a good time. But if people are listening to you, you are responsible for disseminating this information to the community that watches your show. Gentlemen, once again, thank you so much. We are blessed by your presence, your education, your warmth, your heart, and your qualification today. Family, when they ask you to roll up your sleeve, take that instruction. There you go. And on that note, thank you again for joining us. We love you. I pray that you come back and join us again next week. We'll have something new for you. I've always got wonderful information for you, family. Thanks for joining ESP Speaks, and you know what I'm going to say. Be positive and test negative. We'll see you next time on ESP Speaks.